The Honourable Kyle McGinn.
Thank you, President, and I thank the Honourable Wilson Tucker for finally bringing this motion into the chamber to have a discussion on. Really looking forward to it, and funny enough, actually, I think I'm going to focus pretty heavily on the first part of the motion, and I don't genuinely agree with the statement in Part A of the motion. Whilst I think the sentiment's great, I don't believe that there's been a trend of employers moving towards equal time and flexibility in rosters. I think the 4-in-1 roster still exists. I think the 2-in-1 roster still exists. And I think that we need to take note that we haven't got there yet. I think it's great moving towards more flexible working arrangements that balance the work with leisure and family time, but unfortunately not all employers are doing that. There has been some good situations. I know Gruyere out in the Goldfields, when they started up, they went straight to a week-on, week-off roster straight off the bat, which was excellent, President, and they filled up with workers very quickly. But up in the north, particularly in the iron ore industry, and particularly if you don't wear the company's T-shirt, if you're a contractor, you end up doing some absurd hours. And then you also need to take an opportunity to look at the shutdown crews. And that has always been a big issue, because shutdown work is periodic, and it is in a position where there's only so much shutdown work happening during half of the year and then none for the other half. But I've said in this chamber before, members, it only takes employers to talk to each other to coordinate the shutdowns, particularly in the northwest, which would then allow the ability for us to potentially operate shutdown crews for 12 months if you spread it out across the whole period and line up everyone's shutdowns. And again, I've said in this chamber, members, that I'm very proud of the Goldfields for that, because the Goldfields is ahead of the game in that space. Talking with KCGM when I first got into this chamber, I was from Karratha, so I didn't know too much about the working arrangements of workers in the Goldfields. And speaking with KCGM, I learnt that they were already sharing information on shutdowns to ensure that the shutdown crews could operate one at KCGM, and then it would finish up, they'd have a few weeks off, and then they go to BHP. And that discussion meant, one, they didn't have a skill shortage because there wasn't enough shutdown workers at the time, and two, that shutdown workers had a little bit of security in their workers, in their work. Whereas I know friends of mine and constituents that live up in Karratha that will go and do 4 weeks straight and then have a couple of days off and have to go do another 4 to 6 weeks straight because the shutdown starts at another workplace. I think that it's not fair to say that that is the only way that things can be done. Employers need to speak to each other around how they can make it work, and if they did that, you would find there'd be a far more flexible working arrangement for balance of work with leisure and family time, which in benefit, I think, will also find productivity and general mental health at work. We all know in this state and across Australia and the world there is issues, and mental health has been a massive issue, and I think that only gets magnified when you throw in rosters which are referred to, and I'll say it in this chamber, referred to as suicide rosters. 6-in-1s, 4-in-1s. Sorry, and just to clarify, that's 6 weeks on, 1 week off, and then 6 weeks on, 1 week off. That type of roster, and I've stuck to this since coming in 2017, needs to be phased out. We need to be getting towards the 8 and 6, 8 days on, 6 days off, the 7 and 7s. You know, I come from the maritime industry, and the maritime industry was month on, month off. And I know people would go, wow, a month of work, that's a long time. But the month off really did compensate for that, because you were getting the equal amount of time you missed out on with your family. Whereas with the 2-in-1, you're really not getting back 1 week every time you go to work. And I think that grows strain on a worker. And so I do think that the Part A of this motion, bringing it to the chamber today, was very well done, the Honourable Wilson Tucker. But I would not go as far as to say that there's a recent trend in that space. I think some employers have absolutely taken it on board. And there's been a lot of work in the FIFO mental health space. We've seen the inquiry that happened in 2015, I believe, and then we've seen a workplace, there was a release of a code of practice that came out from the government, which highlighted that equal time rosters were the better option for ensuring better mental health in the FIFO industry. So that being the case, the code of practice comes out, which is meant to be where you get your standard from when you're creating agreements, but yet employers still don't do it. It's not good enough. To force a workforce into a position where they don't get equal opportunity as someone who is is wearing a BHP t-shirt or a Rio Tinto t-shirt or a Woodside t-shirt, but someone who's wearing a subcontractor t-shirt gets treated completely different. That's not a fair workplace or fair balance for work with leisure and family time, in my view. And I don't believe that the trend is going anywhere near enough for that in that opportunity. Now, to have a look at the daylight savings part of the motion. The Honourable Wilson Tucker will know that I've probably stirred him up a little bit around trying to learn on daylight savings, because despite living in South Australia for a bit, it was when I was a bit younger, probably didn't understand the benefits around daylight savings then. And since looking into and talking about daylight savings in my electorate, I have a pretty clear response. If you go back to the last referendum, and 4 losses in a referendum is 4 losses, the Honourable Wilson Tucker. You can't just wipe the history clean and say, oh, let's not look at them, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't have another one. Well, Kalgoorlie in the last election, 13,952 people said no, 4,391 said yes. In Kimberley, 15,913 said no, 2,766 said yes. Geraldton, 21,432 in the ag region, but up the north, 21,432 no, 3,734 yes. Pilbara, no, 11,122, yes, 2,228. I'm a Crows supporter, and I know when I'm beat, I'm beat. That is a very clear message from the electorate that daylight savings is not something they're interested in. That's the electorate that we represent, member. And I think the more you have a crack at it, the more you're going to find that that may inflate. Because what's relevant around the areas that I've spoken about? The resource sector, where you have 12-hour shifts, where you have FIFO, DIDO and residential employment, where you have, and the East Coast getting upset about us and our time difference. I couldn't care about that, because the resources and the resource companies and the engine room of Australia is in Western Australia. So if they want to deal with us, they can stay up a bit later. But also, I did find it interesting that you didn't mention that Asia, for example, doesn't have daylight savings. So Western Australia has a very good time zone working with Singapore and other Asian countries, which is a benefit to Western Australia over the eastern states. So whilst I'd noticed the Honourable Wilson Tucker focused very solely on the positives around daylight savings to try and convince us to get back on board, maybe another referendum, my view, going through what I've seen and what I've heard, particularly from my constituents, it's pretty clear that they voted up a member for the Daylight Savings Party, but they do not support daylight savings. So it is something that I'm sure I would have been interested, the Honourable Wilson Tucker, to hear your experiences in the electorate around pushing the daylight savings agenda, to see if you've had a response, to see if you can turn 13,952 voters in the Kimberley across to the positive for daylight savings. I think that you will find, particularly in the resource-enriched areas, that daylight savings is not something they're going to be contemplating. But I am interested to hear from other members about daylight savings and learn what I can. I went to the airport yesterday morning at 5 in the morning and it was dark, and I liked that because I knew it was early. and I'm not normally out of bed at that time. So, but look, I commend the Honourable Wilson Tucker for bringing the motion and giving us a bit of a history lesson on daylight saving, something I've been absolutely hungry to hear for the last 2 years. And thank you very, very much. And I look forward to listening to the other contributions of the chamber.